I wanted to ask one question. How many of you have been to Rome? Oh, a lot of you, good. And how many of you have been to the Pantheon? Pretty much everybody who goes to Rome goes to the Pantheon. It's one of those things you have to go to. And at first glance, I would say that the Pantheon looks like, or seems to be a fairly uncomplicated monument. We can see that it has an inscription in large bronze letters across the front of the building, above the columns, over the front porch. We know its location because it's still standing. We can walk up to it. There it is. And it appears to be mostly intact, as it was in antiquity. But for those of us who like to dive more deeply into these monuments, the more you look at it, the more complicated it gets. And very intriguing questions begin to emerge, such as, who did build the Pantheon and when? How do we know that this building is actually the Pantheon? What was its function? And how did it survive into the modern age? Has it always looked the way we see it now? And these are not always, the answers to these questions aren't always obvious. And so that's what I want to kind of go through today and talk about how we know the answers to these questions, or what, in some cases we know the answers, in some cases we have to make an educated guess on the answers, and how we go about doing that. What is the evidence that we use? Literary, archaeological, and even artistic representations from later periods. And all of this contributes to how we understand not only this monument, but other monuments in Rome that are less well preserved and sometimes have even vanished, where we can go back into drawings and records and find out about it. So that's what I will try to do here today. So let's start with who built the building, when, and how we know it is indeed the Pantheon. We have several types of evidence, and a lot of it is on your handout for today. The inscriptions and the literary texts in particular. We also have the archaeological remains, and we have what we call post-antique documents, that is, writings and drawings that were done in periods after antiquity, so the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, and beyond. So we're going to start with the inscriptions. And so there are two inscriptions on the front of the building. If you go looking at the building, you will mostly recognize the one, this one, with the big bronze letters. Those letters are about a foot high, set in. That's not the original bronze. It was restored at a later period, but the outlines of the letters were always there, visible. And these letters say, Marcus Agrippa, son of Lucius, 3 times consul, made, and then we supply the word this, or this building. That implies a date for the building of around the year 25 BC, because that's when we have other sources that tell us Marcus Agrippa built a Pantheon in Rome. And that would put it in the reign of Augustus, so very early in the empire. However, there's a second inscription, and you can see it here in the lower part. It's carved on what are known as the fascia, these sort of stair-stepped bands that are just below the main frieze there, just between the bronze letters and the tops of the columns. And that inscription tells us that the emperors Septimius Severus and his son Caracalla, when they were co-emperors, restored the building in some way during the year 202. So almost 2 centuries after the Agrippa building was built, or more than 2 centuries later. All right. The earliest reference we have to a building called the Pantheon that is a textual reference is also from an inscription, a rather lengthy one here. Romans like to record things, write them down. So they either get carved in stone or put on, incised on bronze tablets, set up in public. And religious records in particular, and decrees of the emperor and things of that sort are the common documents that get preserved in inscriptions. In this case, this is a group of priests known as the Arval Brethren, and they met regularly and had sacrifices and ceremonies and made prayers together for various occasions. And on this record, and they recorded all of these. We have a long series of texts that come from their headquarters. And this one records that the priests gathered in Pantheon, in other words, in the Pantheon. And the year of the inscription we know because all of their inscriptions are dated. They tell us the day, the month, the day, and the year when they met. This one, the year date is 59, so in the middle of the reign of the Emperor Nero. They were meeting in the Pantheon. So we have a Greek writer and historian by the name of Cassius Dio. He wrote a work simply called History, and his history was very long. It's been sort of truncated, like Reader's Digest version was created of it in the 5th or 6th century AD. And, but his text goes through the whole history of Rome, starting from the very beginning and as far up as his time period, which is in the time of the early 3rd century. And he writes about Marcus Agrippa, whose name is on the building a Pantheon. And he is the one who tells us more or less that it happens around the year 25 BC. He also names it as a structure that was burnt during a fire in the year 80 AD. This would be under the Emperor Domitian. And then there are 3 more sources. Jerome, who was an early Christian writer and who wrote a chronology of the world history, and another man named Orosius, who's writing another history. They're writing in the 4th century, 4th century AD. They tell us that the Pantheon also burned in a fire caused by lightning that happened in the year 110, and this would be under the Emperor Trajan. So now we have 2 fires of the building. And it's actually the words that they use when they describe the fire. And in the case of Jerome and Orosius, they're writing in Latin, and the Latin terms they use indicate that they mean it burnt completely, concrematum, so it just burnt completely to the ground. Did it or not, we don't know, but that's the implication. So this would then imply, and then we have another source from the 4th century, so a very late source, that tells us that the Emperor Hadrian restored the building. Okay? So based on all of that evidence, what we seem to have is a building that was built first as the Pantheon, looking like this, built by Marcus Agrippa, and that it had some fire damage and was restored by Hadrian, and then restored again by Severus and Caracalla. And that is what people believed until the 19th century. In other words, that the building we see today was the building that Agrippa built in 25 BC. But if we look at archaeological evidence, we begin to see some interesting things happening. By the early 19th century, people started realizing that the Romans had an interesting habit with their building materials. That they would stamp bricks. So this is a close-up of a Roman brick. And Roman bricks actually do not look like our little, rectangular kind of cubic bricks. They were as big as this podium top. They were like 2 feet by 2 feet square, and they were relatively thin, only about maybe 1.5 inches thick. So they're not big. They're not like the kind we're used to. Each one might get a stamp on it, or at least a certain number of them. We're not sure exactly how often they stamped them, but they would have stamps on them. And in the early 19th century, they began to realize there were some stamped brick fragments they were finding around the Pantheon, and they began to read the inscriptions on them. This is one. Here it has, in fact, at the center, the word Paetinus. It's abbreviated. It says Paetinus et Apronianus. They were consuls in the year 123. Romans labeled their years by who were the 2 consuls, because every year you had 2 new consuls. They reigned for 1 full year, so that was how you could keep track of time. And so that, for us, translates into the year 123 AD, which is in the reign of Hadrian. All right. So, moving to the later 19th century, we get an Italian archaeologist, Luca Beltrami, and he excavates under the floor of the Pantheon that we see today. And he looked around the outer edges outside the structure to try to see what he could see. And he found evidence of a very large paved area underneath the current floor at a lower level, about 2 meters lower, so 6 feet down below. And the drawing here on the right, these sort of funny channels that you see in the center of the circle there, those are plans of where the trenches were. They lifted up the floor paving of this floor and dug down underneath, and that's when they found this lower level of concrete and some bits of marble paving and other things that were there. So there was some sort of earlier floor underneath this building. And so that's important. And underneath the porch of the building, so the front, at the very bottom there where the porch is, where you would enter today, underneath that they found also another sort of layer of concrete that was about the same shape but a little bit wider than the current porch. So another porch, it seems. So it was a man named Rodolfo Lanciani who was in charge of excavations and antiquities in the city of Rome at the end of the 19th century into the early 20th century. And he was when he decided, well, what they're finding must be Agrippa's Pantheon. In other words, the building that we're looking at now wasn't the one Agrippa built, but rather these remnants that are underneath the floor of the current Pantheon. That's the one that was built in 25 BC. Now, for some reason, and we don't know why, Lanciani decided that that earlier Pantheon was facing the exact opposite direction. So the current building, the porch is on the north side, it faces north. He thought that the porch opened the other direction for that. Again, his reasoning was not clear to most people as to why. He just made that pronouncement. That pronouncement stayed for a long time and has been argued over. All right. By the 1930s, we get some new studies, and those brick stamps come back into play. A man named Herbert Bloch looked at all of these brick stamps, and he made catalogs. And he did this all throughout all buildings in Rome, buildings nearby in a place called Ostia, and he began to try to organize them and put dates on them, and use these to then date the buildings in which they were found. Because if you find a building and it has a brick stamp, and that brick stamp date is 123 AD, then you can say, okay, the building has to have been built anytime from that date onward. It can't be before, it has to be after. So that gives us finally some dates for buildings that we didn't have dates for. And he decided that based on the brick stamps that were identified in place, in other words, occasionally you can actually see them still in what we call in situ, in other words, still in their original place in the building. Because there were some still in place in the Pantheon that could be seen, he says the building was built sometime between around 118 or 119 and was finished around 120, 125, or 126. So it was entirely built during the reign of Hadrian. And so that becomes the new way of looking at it from the 1930s onward. Now, his chronology also has to take into account, well, why would Hadrian be rebuilding it? Well, we have those sources that tell us he did rebuild it. And the most likely reason is from that fire that happened in 110. So, there are some interesting things, though, about that. So, the building is an unusual building, and we'll talk a little more about why it's really unusual, but as a freestanding building with a dome, with this round, a rotunda, it's quite different. It has these 3 parts. So it has a front porch, it has what's called the transitional block, or intermediary block, some people call it, and then it has the cylinder, the drum, or the rotunda, however you wish to refer to that. So, if we move forward in time to 1987, a group of scholars who consisted of one practicing architect who was very interested in Roman architecture, and a couple of architectural historians by the name of Paul Davies, David Hensel, and Mark Wilson-Jones. They were trying to explain some things they found a little bit odd about the Pantheon. Because if you look, again, if you look really closely for a long time at this building, you start to notice things you didn't notice when you just kind of passed through it on your first or second visits. And one of the things that they found very odd was what they call the awkward and incoherent meeting of the building's three parts, the rotunda, the transitional block, and the portico. And that would be this area here, which is right here. And so, do you see anything unusual about it?
It doesn't line up.
It doesn't line up, exactly. So what we have is a cornice here, but then we've got what looks like a ghost cornice. And it's about 10 Roman feet higher than where the current roof line is for the porch. They concluded that in the design process for the Adriatic building, that there was a plan to have a taller porch. The current porch has columns. These columns, if we take away the bases and the capitals and just look at the actual column shaft itself, are 40 Roman feet high. They are solid granite. That's a single piece of granite. That means they each weigh quite a few tons. If you go up 10 more feet to a 50-foot high granite column, and that can be quarried, we have evidence of it, we have a few actual surviving ones here and there in the Roman world, it becomes exponentially heavier and harder to move. So their theory is that they really did want these 50-foot columns for this. That was what the porch was planned for, that's the way the whole thing had been planned, that something happened and they couldn't get those columns. A very likely scenario is they were quarried, they were on a ship, the ship crashed in the Mediterranean. And you know, if someday in the future somebody finds a ship on the bottom of the Mediterranean Sea that has about 16 or so granite columns from Egypt that are 50 Roman feet tall, we'll know that is what happened. But for now, it's a theory. But it is a very good theory that something happened along the way. And this required adjusting the design to now accommodate using what they could get, which was 40-foot columns, which may have already been on site somewhere in the city. So Wilson-Jones has since examined other parts of the building and has noticed that there are other adjustments that had to be made in the design. If you've ever walked all the way around the back side of the building, there's all this stuff that's kind of built onto the back of it. In fact, back there, these structures here, they are not physically attached at the lower level, but at a certain point higher up, they become actually continuous with the fabric of the building, of the Pantheon itself. And what seems to have happened is that at a certain point, as they're building up the walls of the rotunda, either some sinkage happens or some cracking, something is happening that is unnerving them about whether this is going to stand. And so they build these additional structures on the back that are essentially buttressing the back of that, supporting that back wall. And so there are several places where there are sort of adjustments that are made in the architecture of the building as they're building it. Which I think is a really good indication that this is an innovative building too, that they haven't done this before, and so they're running into problems as they're doing it. And they have to fix it on the fly, as it were. So these are the drawings that they have created for this. So this is with the 50-foot columns and how the pediment would line up, and this is how it looks today with the 40-foot and then that shadow pediment up behind there. So, since we are talking about the design issues, this is a great time to kind of take a little detour for a moment and talk a little bit about the construction features that make this a very unique, I shouldn't say very unique, a unique building, and really an outstanding example of Roman architecture and engineering. It has these three parts, as I said, the porch, the transitional block, and the rotunda, topped with the dome. If we look at this, so porch, this the rotunda rests on a very deep concrete foundation. And if we look at this, I can talk you through a little bit of how things change as you move from bottom to top. So the aggregate of the concrete, so when you make, the way Romans made concrete is really, it's not like today where they come with this thing that they pour. They don't pour concrete. They have it, it's much more like a thick mortar that gets mixed with an aggregate. So some sort of either broken up stone or crushed brick or pottery or other material, depending on what you're actually going to use it for, that the aggregate changes. And so in this case, starting at the very bottom, the heavy part, the part that's going to bear the most weight, they use big chunks of travertine, which is a form of limestone that comes from the northeast, comes just northeast of Rome, so not far away. And then the other thing they do is, you'll notice, this is not a big, thick, solid wall. There's these recesses and also some that open from the outside that really are not accessible. They're like little slot windows that they're hollow spaces in the wall. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 piers. So the dome is actually being supported on 8 piers, not on the whole wall necessarily. The wall is doing all sorts of interesting things that I'll show you in a moment. And so as you look, as we move up from the bottom to the top of the building, the aggregate, the thing that's mixed in with the concrete, gets lighter and lighter. So we start with heavy materials at the bottom, travertine, because that's got everything rests on that. And then we switch over to a mixture of travertine and tufa, which is a slightly lighter type of stone, again quarried locally. And then brick gets, broken up brick is used, and then we finally end up with pumice at the very top, or scoria, as it's sometimes called. This is, again, a porous, sort of lightweight material. So that when we get to the dome itself, the part that has to be self-supporting up at the top, is of the lightest weight material possible. So that is a way of sort of dealing with some of the stresses. There we go. So the building itself also is what we refer to in architecture as a true dome. That is to say, it has a height and a diameter that are the same. So you can put a sphere inside. You can put a full sphere. Now, what's interesting about the way the Pantheon is designed, though, is that notice this is where the diameter is crosswise. That's the point at which the dome is actually, the vault of the dome is actually springing from that point, that is, it's starting there. But notice on the outside, you don't see it till you get up here. So the cylinder walls, the drum walls here, are actually coming up higher, again, as a form of buttressing, a way to kind of help support the outward pressure that's going to come from the roof pushing down on it. So it's a way of, sort of, again, dealing with these different stresses to stabilize everything. So if we look at the inside of that dome, you'll notice there are what we call coffers, these recesses. These were cast. There were forms, probably wooden forms that would have been underneath, on top of which the concrete is placed. And so that creates these recesses. And they're not just decorative. By taking out those, kind of scooping out those bits of concrete from the underside, you're again making the dome lighter. You're getting a little less weight to have to deal with. But it also does create a nice, attractive effect. And if you start looking at it for a while, you'll notice you can see with the shadows, there's almost like a spiraling effect on it as well. Imagine it painted deep blue and trimmed with gold and with maybe stars or rosettes in gold set inside each coffer. It really would have been stunning with that sort of decoration. I would also just show you this picture so you can see the scale of this. This is a photo from probably the late, I want to say one of these men might be Rodolfo Lanciani, I'm not sure. But from the very late 19th, early 20th century, they're standing by best estimates, I would say they're standing somewhere right up about here. There's a coffer below them, and then there's a coffer below and a coffer above. Yes?
Do we have any idea how they were even able to pour concrete
Yeah.
at that height? Like, how?
Yeah, well, the best theory that I've seen is that it took a tremendous amount of timber, that they had to have an entire interior form built in wood underneath, and that once the concrete sets up, then they can pull that formwork away and take it out. Their theories range from, kind of knocking it down and letting it fall to the floor, which seems damaging, to having a way to kind of swing it out and push it out. Because one theory is that some of these, like where you have these cornices, before the marble part was put on, that there would have been a brick ledge, and that might have been used to support some of the formwork. Again, nobody has the absolute answer on that, but it has to be formwork.
Are they like carrying concrete by hand?
Yes, they're carrying concrete by hand. Yes, they're. So if you've ever seen a bricklayer's hod, probably baskets on the backs of the laborers who were going up, and they may have been enslaved laborers, but a lot of them were actually daily paid, like day laborers who came and worked on these jobs as well. Because there've been a lot of good studies done on that, the labor issue of Roman architecture. But yeah, so it would have manual labor, tons of it, but also some of the machines that are reproduced in this show here, like the lifting cranes with the wheel and some of these other devices, they would have used those with this. That's how they would get some of those big pieces of material up, how you would raise columns up, because they're going to come in, laying down, but at some point you have to make it stand up straight, right? So they would have to rig pulleys and use cranes and all of those sorts of devices to make this happen. And use acrobates to make sure the floor is level or has just enough slope to get all the water to go to the drain, because we do have a hole in the roof in this building, so water does come into it when it rains. Anyway, so another feature of the construction is the relieving arches. And there are just, dozens of them. And they run both parallel to the wall, so they are kind of within the wall, but then they are also running from sort of the exterior of the wall to the interior. So they're both, sort of distributing pressures down the wall, but then also stabilizing from interior to exterior. So it's a whole network of these. And if we look inside, where the veneers have been removed, you can actually see them. It's a little hard unless I draw some lines over where they are, but you can see, if you go into the Pantheon, next time you're in Rome, go to the Pantheon again and look at these details, because you may not have been thinking about them when you were there the first time. But, yes. This is, so if we go back, it's like in these recesses, these particularly the square recesses that are there, rectangular ones, the veneers that used to be on the wall that covered up the brick. One thing is, when you go into these big buildings like this, if you see a Roman building, you see the Roman ruins, the brickwork, it would have either been plastered over and painted or colored in some way, or it would have marble revetment. Marble revetments leave traces. We see holes, often patterns, and that's how people reconstruct what the marble revetment might have looked like. They don't always know the colors, but they can tell you the pattern, like what size squares, whether there were small pieces, whether there were diamond shapes, etc. So they can reconstruct some of that based on the holes that are left from the clamps that helped hold veneering on the wall. Yes.
I'm trying to figure out what burned. I mean, what part of this?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. That's a good question. Well, with this building, probably nothing. But the building prior to it was likely had a timber roof. And so timber and tile. And this is the thing that in most Roman temples and other buildings, when they burn, they could have had concrete walls, but until they were able to make these, because until this time they couldn't make this kind of dome that spanned this size. I mean, 43 meters, I believe it is. It's a huge expanse. That was not possible before, so mostly those would have been done with timbers and truss roofs and things, and so that would burn. And when those burn, they collapse. Then, if you think of Notre Dame,
Yes.
okay, that's pretty much the kind of thing that could happen, and that's what would burn. So, relieving arches. All right. Couple more little pieces on just sort of general construction. So the roof of the Pantheon is right now covered in lead. That was replacing earlier materials, but these are called step rings, and they also are a form of sort of buttressing, a way of sort of helping to relieve the pressures of the thrust of the dome. And the oculus itself has a certain function there too. It's one of two primary sources of light for the building, the other being the front door. There were no other windows that brought light into the building. It was that and the doorway, and they do provide quite a lot of light. Probably they would have oil lamps and things too, but this is primarily how it's happening. And the oculus again also helps lighten the roof, because that is the most vulnerable point on the dome, the very top part, and so it's open. The Romans will later learn how to make domes that maybe not quite as big as this, but that don't need an oculus. So, and then they can put windows around the walls. And they get pretty clever with it when they move into the next century. Just to give you a sense of size, I was so happy when I found this image, because it shows you the Superdome in New Orleans in relation to the Pantheon, as well as Hagia Sophia, I believe it is, St. Peter's in Rome, St. Paul's in London. So St. Peter's is the pink one here, very tall. St. Paul's is the orange here. This is Hagia Sophia in the purple, and then of course the Superdome in yellow. So, Superdomes are really huge compared to this. But, I mean, again, the Pantheon is one of those things. It's very big. It is the largest unreinforced concrete dome. It was surpassed, I believe, in 1950, in terms of, and it was the actually largest span for a dome, reinforced or unreinforced, until 1958. So that's, I think, kind of impressive. All right. So just a little more about the date of the building and then a few more things. So the date of the building, as we see it today, has recently been challenged, again on the basis of brick stamps, noting that there are brick stamps from the Pantheon here that seem to be from the time of Trajan. And there have been arguments about, people have known this for a long time, but people have not really dealt with it well. They've said, oh, it's stockpiled brick, that they're just old brick that they're using. But there seems to be a little too much of it, perhaps, for that, and so the argument is now being put forward that, and if the building didn't start until 118, but the fire was in 110, it's like, what was going on for 8 years that it took so long? I mean, those of us who've gone through similar things here in this country know that sometimes it does take a while to get something rebuilt, but Romans were usually a little better at it, at least for important buildings. So one thought is that, in fact, they did start building it in the reign of Trajan, and if that is the case, it's possible that Trajan's big architect, a man named Apollodorus of Damascus, who we know also designed a lot of siege machinery and was the designer of the Forum of Trajan in Rome and the Baths of Trajan. And there are a lot of similar design characteristics between some of the domes in the Baths of Trajan and the Pantheon. That the building work here may have started in 112, 114, and so it's started by Trajan, but it's finished by Hadrian. And those kinds of things happened in the Roman world as well. One emperor begins a project and another one finishes it. In terms of the inside of the building, no ancient author actually describes our original or our current building in any great detail. They sort of give us glimpses of things. So we have Pliny the Elder in his Natural History telling us that Agrippa's Pantheon had Syracusan bronze capitals, that it had a statue of Venus who had pearl earrings that were fashioned from giant pearls that Cleopatra had, that Julius Caesar had, or that Augustus had brought back. And then that there were a series of sculptures made, caryatids and other sculptures made by a man named Diogenes, who was from Athens. And then we get references to statues of Mars and Venus and of the deified Julius Caesar being put in here. Because originally, when Agrippa built his Pantheon, he wants to put a statue of Augustus in there. And Augustus says, no, 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 we can't do that. Instead, he puts Augustus's father, his adopted father, the great uncle, Julius Caesar in there. So, you know, these are all very interesting things, but they don't tell us a whole lot about how things may have looked in the original Pantheon. And so we look at the current one and wonder, well, how much did the original one look like this? And that's something I think we will not know very well, because we'll never be able to fully excavate underneath this building and see all of its features. There are, however, a few things that we can say now about that earlier building. And that comes from some excavations that occurred in the 1990s, 1995, 96. Thanks to some gas work that needed to be done by the local Italgas. They were digging up right at this corner at the front of the Pantheon here in the piazza. This is what they revealed. It was fairly deep. They had to dig down pretty far. And so here's the street level up here, and down here is what they went down to, and then even further below that. What they revealed were, first of all, some fountains that existed during the time of the original Hadrianic building. Because when you go to the Pantheon today and you walk in, you're actually walking in at a level about 2 meters higher than an ancient Roman would have. They would have had to have climbed almost anywhere from 7 to 11 steps to come from the main level up to the porch of the building. So it was actually the ground level around the building in antiquity was much lower than it is now. So we have that. And then the other thing they found was that underneath the current steps, so the current steps are here, but the main ground level is up here. So as I said, all of the actual steps from the Hadrianic era are not visible. Beneath those steps is another set of steps, about 2 meters lower.
Wow.
Those are the steps to the porch of Agrippa. And since they're under the steps of the current building, now we know for sure Agrippa's building also faced north. So we can finally answer that one question. It is in fact oriented exactly the same way, which means that if the later building is oriented the same way, it could mean that Agrippa's building also had a round portion beyond the porch. Nobody thinks it was like the Pantheon that we see today, that it had a vault, because that was impossible, but that it may have been a round courtyard type building with a portico around it and a series of sculptures and other things in it. That it might have been more like a kind of sacred precinct and not an interior building. So there's some of the floor on the inside, just to give you a sense of that. This patterning, too, is something we see a lot in both Trajanic and Hadrianic architecture. And the threshold block that you walk over when you come in is a piece of what's known as Africano marble. It comes from the island of Teos, which is off the coast of modern-day Turkey. And that one marble block is, by some people, thought to be a reused block from the original Pantheon. So this might be one piece of Agrippa's Pantheon that survived and was reused. We can't be certain of that. All right, so what do I want to say? So the original building, we don't know what it was used for exactly, other than we know that the priests of the Arval Brethren met there once. We hear that Hadrian held court there once, at least, or maybe somewhat regularly. Did official business there. We know that there were statues of Mars, Venus, and Julius Caesar decorating it, but possibly other statues. We know that when Cassius Dio is describing it, he attributes the name Pantheon to the fact that the dome looks like the dome of the heavens and therefore all of the gods. And so that's what the name Pantheon means all the gods. But was it a temple? We don't know precisely. best theory, based on what we do know, is that it might have something to do with the imperial cult. That is to say, the worship of the deified emperors, because deified Julius Caesar is in there, Mars and Venus are in there, and they were considered ancestors of the Julio-Claudians. The location here, which is, here's the Tiber, this is the campus marshes. That location is next to a little what used to be a body of water. It got drained away, but over here, a little kind of swampy area. And that little swampy area near that is where Romulus, the first king of Rome, well, it's one of the places where he may have ascended into heaven. And so tying it to this idea of deification and the kings of Rome, the leaders of Rome, this may be something this may be what that building was used for. So the final thing I want to do, because I know I'm running out of time, is to look at how did the building survive? What are the things that happened to it over time after the Romans, or not after the Romans per se, but after the ancient period. So we see drawings of it, we can see various things happen. We know that, for instance, the porch gets sort of walled in a little bit. The building became a church in about 609. The Byzantine Emperor Phocas gave it to Pope Boniface IV, and it has been a church ever since, and that's really one of the main reasons why it still survives, and of course great luck that it was a sturdy building. It used to have bronze roof tiles. It used to have some bronze up underneath the ceiling of the porch. Those things were all removed. One of the most notable removals was the one by Pope Urban VIII when he took it to make canon for Castel Sant'Angelo. And that was when we end up with people around Rome saying what the barbarians did not do, the Barberini have done, because Urban was of the Barberini family. But we also have the addition of bell towers to the building, so sometimes known as the donkey's ears.
When were they removed?
When were they removed? I'm going to tell you about that. So they were put in place under Urban VIII. So in that period, and then so we see them here in the 18th century. Also, I would point out the attic interior used to look like this. Now it looks like this, and a little tiny bit of it was restored to look like the old part. That happened in the 18th century. The painting, by the way, is this is from Panini's painting. It's in the National Gallery in Washington, D.C. And bell tower's still there in this photo from around 1870 to 1882. But after the reunification, not reunification, I should say, the unification of Italy, the foundation of the modern nation of Italy in 1870, people got very interested in the monuments, and one of the things they were doing was sort of freeing them from their accretions, so all the little medieval structures and other things that got built up against it, and trying to get back to the original ancient monuments, and that's when these were taken down, around 1882, 1883, as part of the program of sort of, again, freeing up these monuments in order to be able to get back to antiquity. So, one potential view of what it could have looked like inside in antiquity, with a little bit of the color for the dome, with the kind of lighting that you would have seen. They're getting much better in predicting what lighting could have looked like at different times of day and with different sources in computer modeling. So I expect in a few years we'll get even better ideas of what things could have looked like. But it was a stupendous building, and you have to keep in mind that people would have entered thinking they were coming into a standard Roman temple. It had the standard Roman temple front. And then, so it's got the porch, it's got the columns. You're coming in standing at a lower level. You won't see the dome very well. There's a portico, there's like colonnades, so kind of like a wall coming up to either side of the front porch. So you probably don't see the curving rotunda walls either on the sides. So when you walk through that front door and you come inside, And you see this big open round space and this high curving dome over top of you and tons of color. It's going to be a tremendous surprise to you. And unlike anything else really in the city of Rome at this time, and probably really anywhere else in the Roman world at this moment. So it was an amazing building, and one that is definitely, it's always, if not my very first place, it's one of my first places that I always go whenever I go back to Rome, because it's just a phenomenal building. It's amazing how, even though it's a vast interior space, it feels very intimate and comfortable, and really it has a special quality that no other building has. And Renaissance architects and all architects since then have really appreciated that about this building. So that's where we can end.